So after I made my last video, these three LEDs on my LED strip just like turned yellow. And I was like, fuck, I'm going to have to get a brand new LED strip before I record the next video. But then I realized they're yellow. Yet the Iterate channel logo, it's yellow. So in the end, it all worked out. I feel like there was something else I was supposed to talk about. Oh, right, there's a war. Unless you literally haven't closed Elden Ring since its release, you've probably noticed that Russia invaded Ukraine. It's all over the news, all over social media, and is all anyone can talk about. But my question is, why do you care? And if you don't, should you care? Do you have an ethical obligation to the people of Ukraine? I'll cover that more complicated question later in the video, but let's first figure out why you care. In my mind, there are three options here. Option 1. Political calculations. Now, this is a philosophy channel, so I'm going to keep the politics talk to a minimum, but there is a chance that once you heard that Russia invaded Ukraine, you sat down with a piece of graph paper and did some political calculations about the role of Ukraine as a buffer state between NATO and Russia, and of the distribution of natural gas along Ukraine's shoreline, or maybe about the current state of international norms regarding sovereignty, and came to the conclusion that this intervention would put the whole balance at risk, and that is what made you decide to care about Ukraine. Maybe that's what you did, but it's probably not what you did. Option 2, you are virtue signaling. Nowadays, virtue signaling is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and personally, I think it kind of gets a bad rap. First of all, most people that are virtue signaling don't even know that they're doing it. They have the real emotion going along with their opinion. They just haven't spent the work to figure out why they feel that way. Second of all, virtue signaling is a conditioned response that's a necessary part of a functioning society. Nowadays, it gets associated with white suburban women posting black squares on their Instagram page. But historically, it's a necessary part of how movements get started. Most people don't have the time to sit down and figure out what their moral parameters are before they come to a conclusion. They're busy living their life and doing a job. So this sense in which we just go along with whatever society tells us is immoral is something that we need in order to have the sort of social unity that is necessary for a movement to succeed. So honestly, I don't hate people for it. And if that's what you're doing, good on you. Option 3. They are human, god damn it. This is what most people would give their reasoning as. Ukrainians are human, they're suffering, and so I care. And this is where I get to the philosophical meat and potatoes of this video. But first, I gotta ask, are you sure it's because they're human and not just because they're white humans? I'm sorry to even be bringing you down this path again, but it does feel like it makes a bit of a difference. Because yeah, we freaked out about Palestine, but we definitely weren't calling for war with Israel, and that seemed to die down in about a week or so. And you could point out tons of differences between the situation in Ukraine and that of Palestine, but it feels like race plays a role as well. And do you want to know how I know that? Because I'm the exact same way. And it's pretty clear to me why I am this way. You see, I grew up with the war on terror, so every time I saw an image of someone in the Middle East, it was them being bombed. My brain just associated people in the Middle East with death and destruction. So when another bombing happened, my brain didn't freak out about that. It just seemed like business as usual. However, I grew up around a lot of affluent white people. I was used to seeing little Jimmy at basketball practice. So if I see someone who looks like little Jimmy getting shelled, then my brain freaks out. That seems like a lot of contrast. And so you can see how brains get this way. And I think it's something that we need to recognize in order to have an intellectually honest conversation about how we approach different political situations. But let's say you're not like me. Let's say you're cultured enough to be sensitized to the destruction of all people, where you care about their suffering regardless of their relationship to you. This is where I get to ask the philosophical question. Is that the morally superior stance? Not in relation to the one where you only care about white people. I'm not going to try to defend that. I mean in relationship to the one where you care more about people who you have some sort of relationship with, whether familial, proximal, or strategic. Well, if you were to ask this guy, Peter Singer, the answer is yes. And his argument goes something like this. Premise 1. Suffering and death are bad. Premise 2. We should stop bad things when it is possible to do so without causing something comparably bad. Conclusion. We should stop suffering and death. This argument explicitly gives no priority to your relationship to the person who is suffering. They could be your own mother, your neighbor, or someone on the other side of the world, and it wouldn't make any difference as to your moral obligation. Singer is making this argument in the context of famine, and goes as far as to say that you should give to those starving up until you reach their level of poverty. Now, Singer's argument is hard to disagree with, and honestly, the world would probably be a better place if we all acted like it was true. However, I don't think he's right. I believe that us humans give moral priority to people that we have some sort of relationship with, and fundamentally, we're not wrong to do so. In fact, I think all of morality derives from evolutionary pressure. We believe something to be moral if holding that belief grants us some sort of evolutionary benefit. Now, obviously, this isn't a perfect science. Evolution is all about trial and error, so there's bound to be some gray area here, but I think that evolutionary pressure is what our morals are trying to approximate. Thus, I hypothesize that there is a relationship between the evolutionary advantage of a certain moral belief and the prevalence of that moral belief in society. I think we can go as far as to say that if valuing a certain human life provided no evolutionary benefit, then we would have no reason to do so, and we would not be wrong for not valuing that life. So, let's formalize what I'm saying. Basically, I'm proposing that we can draw a graph with evolutionary advantage on the y-axis and the prevalence of a moral belief on the x-axis, and that the relationship between the two would be something along the lines of a 45-degree line, although the exact angle, I don't fucking know. Luckily, this is a hypothesis that we can test using iterations of my old friend from the last video, the trolley problem. Just to reiterate, the trolley problem is a moral thought experiment asking whether you would save the lives of 5 people by murdering 1. The setup is that a train is hurtling towards 5 people tied to the tracks. However, you're next to a lever which could reroute the train onto a track containing only 1 person. As we said in the last video, 90% of us would reroute the train and commit murder in order to save 5 lives. However, it turns out that it matters what 1 life we're sacrificing. So all the numbers I'm about to read out are from some researchers over at the University of Wisconsin. And I could be a good YouTuber and remember all these numbers, but I'm tired, so I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm just going to read them out of my notebook. And so what these researchers did was compare your genetic relatedness to the person that you'd have to sacrifice to save 5 strangers, and the percentage chance that you would sacrifice them. And the numbers go as follows. If you share half of your DNA with someone, which would be your kid or your sibling, then only 34% of us would sacrifice them to save 5 strangers. If you share a quarter of your DNA with the person, which would be your grandchildren or your half-siblings, then 47% of us would sacrifice them. And if you share only an eighth of your DNA with them, which would be your first cousin, then 52% of us would sacrifice them to save 5 strangers. And according to this study, it's actually 77% of us who would save 5 by killing some random stranger, which is different from that 90% that I gave in the previous video. But honestly, I prefer the 90% number, not only because it serves my purposes better, but also because that study was done in virtual reality, where the participants actually had to decide in the moment whether they were going to sacrifice the random person to save the 5. And I think that's a bit more accurate, because these researchers from the University of Wisconsin were just like at a fucking farmer's market and would walk up to people and be like, hey, here's a thought experiment. And I think that is just not as realistic. That's pretty self-serving, so I'll let you decide. But I think that the first study is better. But don't worry, the numbers don't stop there, because it's not just your relatedness to someone that determines their genetic relevance. It turns out that we need mates to make kids, so that plays a large role as well. So if the person on the track that you need to sacrifice is your current romantic partner, then only 25% of you will sacrifice them. Even if they are just a hypothetical romantic partner, only 50% of you would sacrifice them to save 5. And even just being the opposite sex matters. If you're currently single and I tell you that the person that you'd have to sacrifice is the same sex as you, you don't really care, and 80% of you will sacrifice them. However, if I tell you that it's a person of the opposite sex, that number drops down to 74%. Even age matters, and there's a reason for this. A 70-year-old is pretty much done influencing the gene pool. However, a 2-year-old is just getting started. So if I tell you that there is a 70-year-old that you need to sacrifice, 62% of you will do that. However, only 34% of you will sacrifice a 2-year-old. Now, you put all those numbers together and you get a graph that looks something like this. About 90% of us would sacrifice a 70-year-old with zero genetic relatedness to us. However, only 15% of us would sacrifice our 2-year-old child. We all clearly have priorities when it comes to who we would save in this situation. So, what would Peter Singer say to this? Well, he actually addresses this in his article. He says that yes, this is what we all would do, but it's not what we should do. My question is there really a difference between those two things? If that is what we would do, if we all would save our 2-year-old child, doesn't that say something about what we value? Singer would just say that our morals are wrong and we need to work to improve them. But my question is, according to who? According to Peter Singer? Because to me, I don't think anyone gets to decide what your values are except for you. Yes, we can have debates about how to best achieve our shared values, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with you. You decide what you value. This is why I think that Singer's argument requires the existence of some god to act as the objective arbiter over who has the right morals. Because otherwise, we're all just sacks of meat disagreeing over which sacks of meat matter more, and there is no referee. So, we should all be prioritizing those lives which best serve our evolutionary interest. But where does that leave us with Ukraine? Well, it's different for different people. If you have a relationship with people from Ukraine, then obviously they should matter more to you. But we should all be focusing on our family first. So I don't think it's fair to be calling someone immoral for caring more about rising gas prices than about the people of Ukraine if they're currently struggling to feed their family. However, for those of us with our basic needs met, the story is a little bit different. And there are two reasons for that. First, the value of a human life does not bottom out at zero. And in fact, that's not initially what I was going to argue in this video. My initial plan for this video was to say that if there was a human life on a different planet that you had no relationship to, that theoretically they wouldn't matter at all. I was going to argue that human lives on this planet matter a little bit because they contribute to the overall gene pool that your children may be a part of, and that we have societal connections to them, but that theoretically a human with no relationship to you wouldn't matter. You know, believe me, I made a video actually, because I do this thing, I make videos to myself to help explain ideas I don't want to forget in the future. Shut up, don't judge me. And you can see in this video the moment where I realized that I'm fucking wrong. Here it is. I think that this is only true. Actually, we have genetic relationships to all people, even if they're on another planet. The brain blast I had in that moment was that it doesn't matter where our genes are. We share 99.9% of our genes with every other human. And it doesn't matter whether that human is right next to us or on a different planet or even in a different universe. What we are fighting for is still in them. 99.9% of what evolution has primed us to defend is in that human, regardless of where they are. In fact, this applies to all living things. We share upwards of 98.7% of our genes with apes, 90% with cats, 85% with mice, and even 60% with a fucking banana. So really, we should be invested in the well-being of all living things. Kind of a lame ending to the video, but that's where I am. Second, we have a vested interest in the smooth functioning of our society. We depend on each other to stay alive, whether that's through the production of food, the setting up of transportation, energy production, or even entertainment. And even if you only care about the society that you're a part of, your in-group, that in-group is quickly expanding. In the age of the internet, with instant communication across the world, with neoliberalism expanding trade relationships, we're all quickly becoming one global society. The suffering of the people of Ukraine is in our face now. We see it on the news, on TikTok, on Reddit. It's all over the place. The question is, do we try to ignore it, or do we let them into our in-group? Ultimately, I don't think that ignoring it is an option. The internet has opened Pandora's box, and there is no closing it. I think that's what the world is reckoning with this whole discussion about whether or not we let them into NATO. Now, I'm not saying that letting them in is a good idea right now, because that could very quickly usher in World War III. But ultimately, I don't think there is any avoiding this problem. The whole world is quickly becoming our family, and we need to come to terms with that. For many of us, our closest friends are people who live in another country. And with the onset of virtual reality, our ability to interface with those people is becoming more and more human. This is why I think that a world government is inevitable. If our best friends are people who live in other countries, we're bound to want to unite under a single set of rules, under a single governing body. Now, this could be utopian or dystopian, and I don't know which one it's going to be. But the boundaries between countries are dissolving, and I don't think we're ready for it.